Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. Recent changes in the government's funding of international aid, coupled with public criticism of some faith-based organizations, have sparked important and complex questions. What responsibility does the government have in saving lives, especially those of non-citizens? And is it acceptable for Christian groups to receive government funding to further the public good? Michael Cerna, CEO of Accord Network, joins me to explore this timely conversation, which also touches on broader issues affecting many different sectors. Michael, thanks for being here with me today.
Thank you, Walter. Very grateful to spend some time together. Thank you.
Yeah. So you lead this organization called the Accord Network. Just as we get going, tell us a little bit about what exactly is the Accord Network.
Yes, it is an association of Christian relief and development organizations. We were founded almost 50 years ago, funny enough. Accord's sort of been behind the scenes and pretty quiet purposefully. But about 50 years ago, there were a dozen or so agencies that were determined to replace this feeling of competitiveness amongst each other and turn that into a spirit of collaboration. So since then, we've grown to now just over 160 member organizations trying to grow together. I guess to oversimplify, we're trying to grow together through formation, collaboration, and learning. It's great, exciting time, I think, to be part of this sector.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, this sense in which the gospel works itself out in word and deed, and Christian organizations have their specific lanes in which God calls this organization to be faithful for their mission. But being together allows what? I mean, you talk about some of these areas, but describe a little bit of why it actually accentuates the ministries when they are banding together in this way.
I think the most important thing is it helps organizations stay focused on the way they serve God best. So the opportunity to partner together, to learn from each other, whether you're a billion-dollar organization or, struggling to get by on $100,000 a year, there's so much you can learn from other Christians in this sector. And there are, like any work, I guess, there are comparative advantages to being a certain size or having certain people on staff. So being able to work together and complement of each other, it makes the whole mission stronger. It makes the kingdom of God more effective and stronger at the end of the day.
What about your own journey? How did you get into this work of relief to development and then ending up at Accord?
Somewhat accidentally. It's been an odd journey to what I'd honestly call sort of a dream opportunity. I graduated, I finished grad school in the middle of the recession, 08, 09. So like a lot of people my age, I struggled to find work in this sector. I started overseas. I went briefly to Brazil, and then I was working in the West Bank, Palestinian territories. And as so often happens in our 20s, I spent 8 or so years probably refining my skills and figuring out what am I cut out for, what am I not cut out for. So I worked in policy research initially, and then quickly realized I am much more suited for relational work, and then probably specifically more in that strategy and design. So when I came back from overseas, I worked for McKinsey & Company, a consulting firm, for a few years. And that was where I was able to, I think, build a lot of skills that I use now in decision-making and project management, strategic design, that sort of thing. So when I left that consulting world, I kind of stumbled back into relief and development, and it was through a One Accord conference at the time. I'd never heard of Accord Network. Honestly, I probably had a negative view of faith-based development work at the time in my youthful arrogance. And I came to One Accord. I was able to meet wonderful, incredibly intelligent people like my future friends at Hope International and World Relief. And I met a dear friend, Chad Hayward, who was CEO of Accord at the time. And we quickly developed a deep friendship and trust in one another. And I always told him, hey, Chad, if you eventually retire from this role, I'd love you to keep me in mind. It was sort of a beautiful thing that was gifted in terrible circumstances. Yeah, so I sort of stumbled into relief and development. And then over that next 10 years, I was always a big champion of Accord, a big champion of Chad's, and I was invited to join the board 2018 or so, and was on there for about 6 years before being invited to serve as CEO. It's a wonderful gift and a real blessed journey for me.
It really seems like, Michael, that God has used different strands of your life and life experience and pulled them together and woven something in your leadership. I mean, you have field experience, dabbling in policy issues, strategic leadership and process and consulting, even from the angle of consulting, which I'm sure you do a lot of in this leadership role, and then your own experience at Accord, kind of, from the board and organizationally, staff-wise as well. I mean, it really does seem like the Lord has set you up. And you have a number of these angles, which I imagine now, in the times that we generally live in, with all the tumults about the nature of faith-based organizations, their relationship to government and partnership, whether funding is received or not received. So I want to take a step back and draw upon the whole range of your experience. A lot of relief development Christian organizations, they have a history of receiving government funding in this public-private partnership, and others don't. There are lots of different models. So take us and give us a big picture. What are different models? What are faith-based partnerships with the government like in these different organizations that are part of the Accord network?
Yeah, very different models, as you say, and the specifics of how a faith-based organization has worked with the government also varies over time. Within our sector, there are lots of examples of how it's done, whether that's being a primary player in battling specific diseases to partnering on education or peace-building initiatives. The level of engagement differs based on the size of the organization and how accessible the government is at the times. The amount of organizations that even partner with the government from within Accord ebbs and flows over time, right? Usually shifting based on which administration is in office and what their policies are, what their goals are. But yeah, being awarded grants as prime recipients or sub-grantees, that's been going on for decades. And if you were to go look at Accord's member list, you'd see such a wide range of missional focus, whether it's clean water and sanitation or peace building or community development. There's such a wide range of what these organizations focus on. And so the opportunities to receive government funding are just as diverse.
Yeah, I'm struck, Michael, that there are diversity, ebbs and flows, depending on administration, depending on the mission of the organization, whether or not they choose to receive funding. And work with the government, it seems to me it's not just about work with the U.S. government. So international organizations, even if they don't receive funding from the U.S. government, they're working internationally with governments in the countries that they're trying to serve. So governmental partnership is not optional. At some point, you're going to have to work with that. And even if you don't receive funding from the U.S. government, my understanding is organizations that may not receive direct funding from the U.S. government still are benefiting and are able to do their work because funding is given internationally to work that's happening. And so a Christian organization in a particular village in a particular area of the world, they may not come organizationally with funding, but they're working in a village that is actually still receiving funding from the government, whether it was USA Aid or some other institution. So even that, the public-private partnership, isn't so clean cut as we don't receive money or we don't work with the government. But internationally, if I'm understanding this correctly, you are going to be working with a government and you need to figure this out. And you probably are going to be working with some kind of funding that's coming from governmental institutions, agencies, whether the U.S. or the home country's government. Is this correct, Michael? And draw out some of the implications of this.
Yes, that's the reality. That the question of if you receive government funding or not, it's almost oversimplifying a complex web of relationships. Like you said, you may get direct funding and win a grant from, USAID or BHA or whoever, whatever agency it is. Or you may not even be aware that you're being impacted. I was working in an organization that we were doing community development work in eastern Nicaragua. And, one of those areas where you have to take a long flight to get to that part of the country, and then you're taking a boat for 8 hours just to reach this area. So, there's no way that you're getting direct government funding for something like that typically, but the Nicaraguan government was receiving funding from the U.S. government for a project that was also happening in the same location. So since this organization was so reliant on local partnerships and local church relationships, they were directly impacted by government funding, even if may not have realized how great the impact was at the time. And that's common all over the world. The direct and indirect relationships have a lot of implications for the way you think through partnership and even the way you think about how we want to receive funding. In some ways, that's beyond your control because you're partnering with organizations, or if you're doing effective work anyway, you're partnering with stakeholders that are receiving funding from other ways that you might not be open to.
Taking a step back from just the funding issue, I want to look at the mission itself issue. So faith-based organizations long been celebrated for their work, whether it's feeding the hungry or peace-building initiative, housing, refugee resettlement. In fact, I recall a Washington Post article that noted President George W. Bush calling these groups armies of compassion that are engaged in all sorts of good work. The conversation seems to have shifted in our moment. I mean, how are faith-based groups being talked about? How are they being understood at this particular time?
That's a good question. In a sense, it feels like it's this moment. In another way, it feels like it's sort of the buildup of the last 15, 20 years where we've seen the American political landscape just become so polarized and separated, unwilling to work together. So I think faith-based organizations, especially in our sector, have felt that, where it feels like there are a lot of opinions voiced about partnership opportunities in this space that are too often driven by, I might use the term political tribalism. You know, does this align with my party's stance or not? So in a way, it feels often like working in this space, especially with conversations around government funding or just the view of faith-based organizations in general, everybody seems to be very careful on how they speak about faith-based organizations, how they partner with us, because the broader implications are felt. If you're in favor of faith-based organizations working in this sector, for example, the thinking seems to be, well, that says something about who I align with or who my tribe is, right? So it makes it a bit complicated. And I don't know that faith-based organizations feel it any more or less than other actors, but it's a trickier landscape to navigate sometimes because, you know, faith in politics is such a complex discussion to have.
It's complex and yet it's here and unavoidable at some level, right? And whether it's the defunding of USAID, which has led to devastating budget cuts for relief, development, humanitarian aid organizations, World Relief and others in the Accord Network, I want to look at this question and ask kind of a philosophical, theological question. What is the role of government in saving lives? What is the role that it has not only to protect its own citizens, but obligations to non-citizens, people who live in other countries? I mean, do you have a biblical theological rubric by which you are pursuing these questions?
I do. You know, to me, this question needs to be asked every 4 to 6 years because there's more disagreement than we often want to admit. I think both in the political space and the theological space. On the political side, each administration has to decide how important soft diplomacy is or soft influence. How much do you value caring for non-citizens as an expression of your country's values, as an expression of our goals towards security and peace around the world? So a country's political mandate, I don't know that it fundamentally shifts every new administration, but there are probably nuanced differences that come up. And so you have to revisit this question every so often. From more of a theological stance, my perhaps oversimplified way of expressing a belief here is that the Bible and scriptures don't necessarily have a direct like for like comparison for the way that we operate in today's world, in the sense that the idea of a democracy where people have, the right to vote and influence politics was not even a thought 5,000 years ago. And so the way that we should respond to that as Christians, I think, is something we need to constantly and consistently be wrestling with together in community, making sure that we're aligned on the core values and beliefs, but willing to hear different expressions of that. So it's a great question that it's hard to answer in 2 minutes, much less, you probably couldn't do it in 2 days.
Yeah, there's a lot there. In some of my reflection on this question, I've reading through the prophets, actually, in the Old Testament for a bit of my devotional reading. And I note that whether it's Ezekiel and his kind of section to the nations, or Isaiah has a section, or Jeremiah has a section, Amos also has a section. In each of these sections, these prophets are not only addressing Israel and Judah about their faithfulness to the covenant, but they're actually addressing the nations. And they're not merely addressing the nations with respect to, did you beat up on God's people? And we're going to hold you accountable for that, which Assyrians and Babylonians did. But God was actually holding them accountable for issues of justice. Did you take care of your own poor? And did you do justice with respect to how you engaged with the nations? I mean, Babylon was judged because of its violence against the nations, even though it was an instrument of God's judgment. And so it really is not a direct correspondence, but it does seem like Scripture leads us to some sense in which secular, even pagan governments, authorities, were responsible to do justice for their own people, but they were also responsible toward other nations, toward the treatment it had of other nations. And what a complicated set of things that we have to grapple with as we think about not only the church's responsibility, but our country's responsibility to the world. So practically, when we think about stewarding our national resources in a way that leads to a more peaceful, more prosperous world, there are also benefits of health, safety, wealth. How have you seen, both within your leadership within the court, but also your own fieldwork, how have you seen ways in which this is twofold? Both, it's a win-win situation, both a manifestation of a fuller picture of the good news of Jesus Christ in action, and an opportunity for the U.S. government or American society to be viewed in ways that actually benefit our national security or reputation throughout the world. Like, can these things be win-win, both for the mission of the church, but also the place of the U.S. in the world?
Oh, absolutely, it can. There are probably two responses that I see too often in this space that are equally harmful, but going in different directions. One is to easily conflate the American mandate with a Christian mandate. As you said, when we're reading the prophets, especially, the way that a nation treats its poor, treats the outsider, is not just something that God views. It's often the most fundamental lens through which God views a nation's righteousness or worthiness to exist in a lot of ways. So it's a fundamental point of the Scriptures and of what we know about God, that He cares about the poor. He cares about how we treat the outsider. So that's a Christian mandate, and that's not to say that that is the same as an American one, but there are certainly some overlapping areas. And so I think that's the other thing I see too often. On one, again, it's too often we conflate those two. On the other hand, it's saying that they shouldn't even exist together, that we should treat a Christian mandate totally separate from government. I think that's, whether you want to call it overcorrection or just the same problem on a different side of the coin, there are certainly opportunities that we've seen at all levels and at all scales where the work of Christian relief and development organizations strengthens the safety, security. It enhances the prosperity of both the United States as a country because of the influence we're having overseas and the influence we're having in these countries, but also those local governments and the countries that we're working in, because they're able to see an expression of our beliefs in a way that benefits their community. So it is, I like your language of talking about it, it is win-win. It's win-win for that community, for U.S. influence, for the Church of God. And so every administration that comes in probably has to define how much they want to prioritize that and focus on it. But it's such a huge opportunity to strengthen goals that should be pretty universal, no matter the administration or the country. You know, looking at safety, security, prosperity, you would at least hope those are universal goals that all have.
Mm. Describe a little bit more. I mean, you may have some concrete examples of what organizations are actually doing. Give us an imagination for those of us who have not worked in this space, who have not been in a particular country. You've already alluded to a couple of things in terms of peace building or clean water, but even that is hard to imagine. Like, what exactly does that look like and mean? So perhaps 2-3 examples that would give us some sense of what this looks like.
When I was working at an organization called Mission Hope, we worked in a country in Southeast Asia that was predominantly Muslim. And the work was focused on providing food security for farmers. So we're talking about Southeast Asia, known as the Pacific Ring of Fire. There are natural disasters happening weekly that are crippling for people living on, in many cases, $2 a day or less, the equivalent of $2 a day or less. So this organization would come in and focus on ways to make these farmers' crops more resilient to any sort of natural disaster that happened. The impact of that would be strengthening families' livelihoods, even to the point of preventing young girls from being at risk of going into being trafficked or anything in that realm. And so as you're strengthening these local communities and improving family security, it's also improving the local economy. And over the course of 3-4 years, what we experienced is that this local government, which was predominantly Muslim, was inviting our organization to serve and expand into other areas, because while they may not have agreed on the theological points, they recognized that what our organization was doing was benefiting their country and benefiting their people. So it was a great, beautiful example of even going across religious lines to see that the work of the kingdom of God isn't making enemies or excluding people. It's something that is good for all. And being able to demonstrate that is paramount. You also see, I think of World Relief as a wonderful example. World Relief is the biggest refugee resettlement organization in the U.S., and they're able to go into conflict areas overseas, places where a lot of people have had to flee their homes, flee their countries, and live in other areas. And World Relief is able to offer security. They're able to offer safety for individuals, and then work through the long, complex, difficult process of relocating families to other areas. That's a great example of there's a local government, a country that for a variety of reasons at a given time is unable to care for its citizens well, and probably won't be able to do that for many years, maybe decades. And an organization like World Relief is able to support those citizens, provide safety and security for them, even as they're relocated. It benefits the local country that is in conflict. It benefits the local host country that has a lot of refugees in it. And it provides a good example of how, from the U.S.'s side, it expresses the values we have for caring for those that are in need and eventually on a pathway to becoming American citizens. So many more examples that are happening all over the world.
Yeah, Michael, the ways in which you've described the situation is one in which issues are actually nested and touch upon one another. So you may work with the first example you gave with agriculture, but that leads to, strengthening families. So it's a kind of a pro-family thing. And then that leads to a reduction in trafficking because of a better economic base that would lead, parents to be ever more vigilant, not to allow their daughters in particular to be trafficked. And then government relations. I mean, and the witness of the gospel of like, wow, here's a Muslim government advancing the work of a Christian organization. All throughout history, we have that of pagan governments, I think of the Roman Empire, being struck by, wow, they love widows and orphans and the vulnerable. They have a hospitality that is so unlike anything we see. And what a powerful witness that is. So I'm deeply encouraged by the work and want to make sure that we are continuing this, because it seems like a marvelous expression of the gospel, and it's working out in all the dimensions of life. And this issue of government, public-private partnership, for our listeners, what kind of scriptural guidance would you give us to say there's a biblical basis, or at least there's a theological humility that we ought to have?
Bingo.
To affirm the fact that for whatever reason, some organizations will in fact not wish to take funding. Other organizations will wish to take funding. And rather than saying one is compromising and another is not, which they may be for any host of reasons, right? I mean, the human heart is that deceptive, but not necessarily so. That actually, in good conscience, Christians can be pursuing these things. And in a time of, you call it kind of tribal polarization, help us lower the temperature of that and give us an imagination theologically for why different organizations would choose the route that they would choose.
The first thing I would say is this is something each organization has to decide for itself. But part of what Accord does is strongly encourage us to not do this in isolation. Connect with other organizations. We're all wrestling with the same question. We need to just when you're a part of a local church community, you're responsible for the way that you raise your children, but the invitation is to do that in community, to create the theological underpinnings for the way you want to do that. Same thing in our sector. We want to have these conversations together and continue to challenge ourselves and sharpen ourselves in it. For the broader audience, I would say it helps me often to scale up from talking about it as a government issue. Think about receiving donations in general. If you're talking about an individual, there could be a number of reasons why it might not be aligned with your convictions to receive funding from a particular business or a particular individual, knowing what might be associated with that. So in that sense, the conversation around government funding is very similar. If you're looking at the Old Testament, specifically the Old Testament, what we see is that God's people look at all relationships as potential pathways in getting closer to what the kingdom of God can look like. So whether we're talking about Joseph and his eventual influence in Egypt, or Daniel and the way that he was working with the government of his day, there are countless examples in the Old Testament where God's people were embedded with foreign governments, not even Christian leadership, but foreign governments who were pagan and very many times against the people of God. And in the short run, you could see how risky that might have been and how it might be conflating values. In the long term, what we saw is hearts start to change and an alignment start to happen where the story of God's people had a bigger platform, a bigger audience, things that, stories that we're still telling today, thousands of years later. So again, it's not a like for like comparison to today, where the government is obviously very different. The role of people in shaping our government is very different today. But I think the core notion is that there are opportunities to treat governments not as enemies, but as potential allies and partners in the way that we live out a Christian witness in whatever community we're living in. And again, sometimes that might be a step too far for some organizations. They feel that it's muddying the waters a bit too much. And I think that's totally valid. And there might be other organizations who see no problem with it. And some of it's just practical too, Walter, where some organizations, frankly, aren't equipped to do that well, to manage those types of partnerships. The requirements aren't easy and the bureaucracy isn't simple. So in a lot of ways, some organizations probably shouldn't be going that route more practically than theologically. But as long as we're willing to have those conversations in community with each other, and we're willing to understand that any particular organization at the end of the day has to hold itself accountable to its own mission and its own vision that God's put on that organization. As long as we're willing to sit there and recognize that, validate that, and do it from a place of love and understanding, I think God's grace always abounds.
Michael, in a time that we face not only large challenges, global challenges, challenges within the church, challenges organizationally as you are navigating leadership at Accord. Personal challenges. We all have things that are going on in our lives. Are there scriptures that you find encouraging that you could leave us with a message of hope, of faith, of maybe even prophetic challenge? I don't know, whatever it may be, but what helps you navigate challenging times?
I'm not someone who is a verse quoter. I think more in narratives and stories. So perhaps it's too easy, but I can't help but go to the life of Jesus, and maybe even more specifically, the life of his disciples, where what you see is 1,000 reasons why the movement of Jesus should have died during or immediately after the life of Christ. There was an aggressive government that was rooting out the movement of Jesus at the time. Christ's own religious powers were against the movement of Jesus at the time and were intimidated by, fearful of what Jesus was doing within his own Jewish community. Thinking about that, and then you add to the fact that Jesus came in as a powerless, poor boy in, some rural town in the middle of the Levant. There are just so many reasons why it should have failed. Power dynamics, political dynamics, resources that he and his people were lacking. And yet through all that, what we saw that was that the sovereignty of God and the ability of Jesus to make friends of enemies, to create followers from people of all walks of life, it turned into a movement that obviously we're still following today. And so I can't help but have hope, knowing that if Christ and then his disciples were able to get past that political climate, to get past such outright persecution, to create a new kingdom that involved people from all over the known world at the time, and they could make it through that. And it wasn't easy, and it wasn't always quick, and it wasn't necessarily always permanent, right? There have been ups and downs and all of that. But if those disciples of his day could make it through a culture and an environment of that time, there's very little about today that can intimidate me to the point of losing hope. If we're aligned with each other, if we're relying on each other, if we can push past the individualism that takes over so much of our culture today and recognize that we need each other, we need to partner together, we need to worship and be on our knees in prayer together. Most of the external things that feel beyond our control, they're still within God's grasp. They're still within God's control. And that gives me a lot of peace and hope.
Thank you, Michael, for this conversation. It has been so enriching.
Thank you, Walter. Very grateful for you and all the work you guys do. Thank you.
Michael talked about the sovereignty of God, no matter what the times we live in are like, of turning enemies into friends, of accessing the full range of gifts that God has given to his people. We're called to be faithful to God's mission and mandate in this world. When Jesus came, anointed by the Spirit, he came to proclaim good news to the poor and to love like Jesus did, to care for those he cared for, requires us to continue in those footsteps. World Relief, the humanitarian arm of the NAE, started a Stand in the Gap campaign. And I like how GAP, G-A-P, can be a helpful acronym for what we can do. G, give, whether to World Relief, World Vision, Compassion, Samaritan's Purse, or any number of the groups who are called to serve the least of these, giving support to their work. A, advocate. Share your concerns about foreign assistance, refugee resettlement, or other issues with your elected officials. You can do something about that. You can go to nae.org/takeaction to find out more practical steps in how to advocate. And P, pray. Pray for our government leaders, nonprofit executives, those who are impacted by the loss of services and support throughout the world. God is sovereign, and he sees, especially those who are the least among us. He wants all people to flourish, and he calls us into this good news work.